The Alpha King imprisoned the silent Omega in his castle, unaware she was the true Luna. Chains rattled against stone as soldiers dragged Alara through the castle gates, her wrists raw from the iron cuffs binding them. She did not scream. She did not beg. She could not. The only sound she made was the scrape of her boots against the cold floor, as two guards pulled her forward, past rows of watching eyes that held no pity. The great hall of Blackthorn Castle rose above her like a mountain of dark stone, torches burning along its walls, throwing long shadows across the floor. At the far end sat Alpha King Draven, his eyes sharp as a blade, his jaw set with the kind of fury that made lesser men tremble. He did not rise from his throne when they brought her before him. He simply watched, arms crossed, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience that had wandered into his kingdom uninvited. "This is the one found near the eastern border," said Captain Roland, shoving Alara forward until she nearly stumbled at the foot of the throne. She was seen moving through the woods after the attack on the supply caravan. She matches the description given by the survivors. Draven's gaze dropped to her, cold and assessing. Alara lifted her chin despite the fear coiling in her stomach. She had learned long ago that fear, once shown, invited cruelty. She had also learned that silence, when perfected, could be its own kind of armor. "Speak," Draven said, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "Tell me why an Omega from a border village was wandering near a caravan that was destroyed by wolves, loyal to no pack I recognize." Alara said nothing. Her lips remained pressed together, her eyes steady on his. It was not defiance, not exactly. It was the only thing she knew how to do. "I said speak," Draven repeated, stepping down from the dais now, closing the distance between them with slow, measured steps. Up close, he was taller than she expected, broader, his presence filling the hall the way storm clouds fill a sky before they break. Still, she said nothing. A murmur rippled through the gathered court. Someone near the back whispered the word spy. Another voice, quieter, suggested she was mute from guilt, too afraid to admit what she had done. Alara heard every word, and every word cut, but she kept her face still, her hands steady at her sides despite the chains. "Your silence will not save you," Draven said, his voice low now, meant only for her, though it carried in the hush of the hall. "If you were involved in what happened to my men, I will know it, one way or another." She shook her head, once, firm. "You deny it, yet you will not explain yourself." His eyes narrowed. "Everyone in my kingdom has a voice, Omega. Everyone except, apparently, you." The words landed harder than he perhaps intended. Alara's throat tightened, an old and familiar ache rising in her chest, the ghost of screams she had once tried to release and could not. She had not spoken a single word in 9 years, not since the night her birth pack burned, not since she had watched from beneath a fallen beam as the only family she had ever known was torn apart around her. The silence had come first from shock, and then, when the shock faded, it had simply stayed, wrapped around her voice like a vine that would not let go no matter how many times she tried to cut it free. Draven did not know any of this. He knew only a woman standing before him, refusing to answer for a crime that had left 3 of his soldiers dead and a wagon of supplies burned to ash. His patience, never long to begin with, was already worn thin from weeks of raids along the border, weeks of watching his people grow afraid in their own homes. "Take her to the lower chambers," he said finally, turning back toward his throne. "Not the dungeons. I want her close, where I can question her myself until she decides to use the voice she is clearly hiding." Roland hesitated. "My king, if she is truly involved with the attacks, then she will tell me eventually," Draven said, cutting him off. "Fear loosens tongues faster than iron bars ever will. Take her." Alara was pulled away before she could offer any further protest. Not that a protest would have mattered. As the guards led her through winding corridors, deeper into the castle, she took in her surroundings with careful, quiet attention. She noticed the thickness of the walls, the placement of the torches, the number of guards at each turn. It was a habit born of necessity, the same instinct that had kept her alive since the night her pack was destroyed. Watch, remember, survive. The chamber they placed her in was small but not unkind. A narrow room with a single barred window high on the wall, a cot pushed against the stone, and a heavy door that locked from the outside. It was nothing like the dungeons she had feared, damp and crawling with vermin. This room was almost livable, which confused her more than it comforted her. She sat on the edge of the cot once the guards left, wrapping her arms around herself as the weight of the day pressed down on her shoulders. Outside her window, the sky had turned the deep violet of early evening, and somewhere far below, she could hear the distant hum of castle life continuing, unaware and unconcerned with the prisoner locked above. She thought of her village, small and quiet, tucked at the edge of the kingdom, where nobody asked questions of the strange, silent woman who kept to herself. She thought of the herbs she used to gather, the quiet rhythm of a life built around not being noticed. She had not been near the caravan. She had been gathering firewood when she heard the screams, when she smelled smoke on the wind, and felt her body freeze the way it always froze when violence found her, no matter how far she ran from it. She had hidden until the soldiers found her wandering, dazed, near the road, and dragged her back, as the only living person found near the wreckage. There had been no attackers left behind to answer for the destruction. Only her, silent and shaking, an easy target for blame. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up as it opened, expecting another guard, but instead, found an older woman entering carrying a small tray of food and a folded blanket. "You must be hungry, dear," the woman said, setting the tray down on the small table near the cot. Her voice was warm, gentle, in a way nothing else in the castle had been since Alara arrived. "I am Marin. I look after the healing needs of this castle, among other things." Alara studied her carefully, unsure what to make of the kindness. Marin did not seem to expect an answer, simply continued arranging the food with practiced hands, humming softly under her breath. "I heard you do not speak," Marin said eventually, glancing up with eyes that held no judgment, only curiosity. "That is not the same as having nothing to say. I imagine you have quite a lot to say, if the right ears were listening." Alara blinked, surprised by the observation. It was the first time in longer than she could remember that someone had suggested her silence held meaning rather than guilt. "I will bring you parchment," Marin continued, straightening. "If you cannot speak your thoughts, perhaps you can write them. It may help you when the king comes to question you again. He is not a cruel man, despite how he seems tonight. He is tired and frightened for his people, though he would never admit to the fear." With that, Marin left as quietly as she had come, leaving Alara alone with her food and her thoughts. She ate slowly, her mind turning over the strange kindness of the healer, the strange calm of the room she had been given, and the strange weight in her chest when she thought of the king's cold eyes studying her, as though he could see straight through the silence to whatever secret he believed she was hiding. She had no secret, only grief, and the silence it had carved into her over the years, deeper than any blade could reach. That night, Alara lay awake, long after the torches outside her window burned low, staring at the stone ceiling above her. She thought of home, of the family she had lost, of the years spent moving from place to place, never staying long enough to be truly known, never speaking long enough to be truly heard. She had built a life out of being overlooked, and now, in the space of a single day, she had become the center of a king's suspicion. She did not know, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, that far below in the castle's oldest chamber, an ancient stone crest embedded in the throne room floor had begun to hum faintly, warm to the touch for the first time in over a generation. She did not know that somewhere in the castle walls, the old magic that had slept since the fall of the last true Luna had stirred, sensing something it had waited a very long time to find. She only knew that she was a prisoner in a castle she had never wanted to enter, judged by a king who did not know her name, silenced by a wound no one could see. And for now, that was enough to carry, without the weight of prophecies she did not yet know existed. Morning came with a bar of gray light slipping through the high window, and Alara woke to the sound of the door unlocking. She sat up quickly, instinct sharpening every sense, but it was only Marin again, this time carrying a small bundle of parchment, a quill, and a pot of ink. "As promised," Marin said, setting the items on the table. "Use them if you wish, or do not. The choice is yours, dear. Nobody in this castle can take that from you." Alara reached for the parchment with careful fingers, running her thumb over its rough edge. It had been a long time since anyone had offered her a way to be understood, rather than simply judged. She looked up at Marin, and for the first time since her capture, something like gratitude flickered behind her eyes. Marin smiled, patting her shoulder gently, before turning to leave. "The king will likely send for you again today. He does not let things rest easily, especially not mysteries. Be patient with him. Beneath the crown, he is only a man carrying more than any one person should have to carry alone." The door closed, and Alara was left once more with her thoughts, and now, with a way to finally begin sharing them, even if only on paper, even if only to a king who had already decided, before ever truly meeting her, that she was something to be feared. She picked up the quill, turning it over in her fingers, and for the first time in years, she considered the possibility of being heard. The summons came just after midday, delivered by a young guard who could not have been more than 20, his nervous energy filling the small chamber, as he explained that the king wished to see her in his private study, rather than the great hall. Alara gathered the parchment Marin had given her, tucking it carefully against her chest, as she was led through the winding corridors once more, this time toward a part of the castle quieter and less traveled than the grand public spaces she had seen the night before. The study was smaller than she expected for a king, lined with shelves of books and maps, a large window overlooking the mountains beyond the castle walls. Draven stood near that window when she entered, his back to her, hands clasped behind him, in a posture that spoke of restrained tension rather than ease. "Sit," he said without turning around, gesturing to a chair near the desk. Alara did as instructed, settling into the chair with the parchment resting on her lap. She waited, watching him, studying the tightness in his shoulders, the way his jaw flexed, as though chewing on words he had not yet decided to release. Finally he turned to face her, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes fell to the parchment in her lap, and something in his face shifted, curiosity briefly overtaking suspicion. "Marin gave you that," he said. It was not a question. Alara nodded. "Can you actually write, or is this simply a delay tactic to avoid answering my questions?" She lifted the quill, dipped it carefully into the ink Marin had also provided in a small traveling pot, and wrote in slow, careful letters across the top of the parchment. "I can write. I was near the road gathering firewood when I heard the attack. I did not see who did it. I was afraid, and I hid." She turned the parchment toward him, watching his face as he read the words. His eyes moved over the sentence twice, as though searching for a lie hidden between the letters. "You expect me to believe an Omega wandered so close to an ambush, purely by accident," she wrote again. "I did not choose where I gather wood. The forest does not ask permission before violence finds it." A flicker of something crossed his face at that, something almost like surprise, though he masked it quickly behind a deepening frown. He walked closer, taking the parchment from her hands to examine it more closely, as though the answer might reveal itself more clearly under closer inspection. "Why do you not speak?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now, less demanding, more genuinely curious. "Is it an affliction, or a choice?" Alara hesitated, quill hovering over a fresh section of parchment. She had not explained this to anyone in years, had not needed to, since most people simply assumed silence and moved on without asking why. But something about the directness of his question, stripped of the fury from the night before, made her want to answer honestly. "I lost my voice the night my pack was destroyed," she wrote. "I was young. I have not spoken since." Draven read the words slowly, and when he looked up at her again, the suspicion in his eyes had softened into something closer to discomfort, as though he had struck a wound he had not meant to find. "Which pack?" he asked. She hesitated again, before writing the name of a small pack that had existed on the northern edge of the kingdom, one that had been wiped out in a raid so long ago that most people had forgotten it happened at all. Draven's expression tightened as he read it, recognition flashing briefly across his features. "I remember hearing of that attack," he said quietly. "I was young myself. My father spoke of it only once, and never again." Alara watched him carefully, searching for any hint of the mockery or dismissal she had grown used to receiving whenever her past came up in conversation. Instead, she found only a strange, careful silence of his own, as though he too understood what it meant to carry a wound too heavy to speak of easily. "I am not convinced of your innocence," he said eventually, straightening, some of the earlier hardness returning to his voice, though not as sharply as before. "But I am willing to consider it further. You will remain in the chamber Marin arranged for you until I have gathered more information about the attack. If you are found to be involved, no explanation will save you. But if you are truly innocent, you will not be harmed. Alara nodded slowly, accepting the terms even though she had little choice in the matter. As the guards came to escort her back to her chamber, she glanced once more at Draven, finding him still watching her with an expression she could not quite name, somewhere between suspicion and something far more complicated. She did not know, as she was led away, that the ancient crest beneath the throne room floor had grown warmer still that morning, nor that old Marin had begun quietly researching old texts about bloodlines long thought extinguished. She only knew that for the first time since her capture, she had been given the smallest sliver of a chance to be understood rather than condemned, and in a life defined by silence, that sliver felt like the beginning of something she did not yet have words, spoken or written, to fully describe. As the days passed, a strange rhythm began to settle over her confinement. Each morning, Marin would bring food and quiet conversation that asked for nothing in return. Each afternoon, more often than not, a guard would come to escort her to the king's study, where Draven would ask his questions, and she would answer them with careful, honest words, on parchment, that slowly began to fill with more than just answers to his interrogations. Sometimes, without meaning to, she found herself writing small observations about the castle, about the mountains outside his window, about the way the light shifted through the glass in the late afternoon. Draven, for his part, seemed to notice these small additions, though he never commented on them directly. He would simply read each page fully before setting it aside, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested he was turning something over in his mind that had little to do with the border attacks he claimed to still be investigating. On the fifth evening, as the guards led her back toward her chamber after another long session in his study, Alara paused at the narrow window along the corridor, catching sight of the mountains beyond the castle walls, painted gold and orange by the setting sun. For a moment, she forgot she was a prisoner at all, forgot the chains that had bound her wrists on the first night, forgot the suspicion that still lingered in the king's eyes even as it slowly began to soften into something else entirely. She only knew that somewhere deep in the ancient stones of Blackthorn Castle, something old and patient had begun to wake, drawn by a presence it had waited a very long time to find. And though Alara did not yet know it, the silence she had carried for so long was about to become the very thing that would change the fate of a kingdom neither she nor its king fully understood, was already beginning to change around them. Old Marin moved through the castle's lower archive with a candle in one hand and a stack of brittle texts balanced against her hip, her steps quiet, despite the urgency pushing her forward. She had not slept well since the night the silent prisoner arrived, her mind circling back again and again to the strange warmth she had felt radiating from the throne room floor when she passed through it earlier that week. In 30 years of service to the Blackthorn line, she had never known the ancient crest to do anything but sit cold and dormant, a relic of a bloodline everyone assumed had ended generations ago. She set the candle down on a reading table buried beneath dust and began sorting through the texts, searching for any mention of the Silvermoon line, the family said to have carried the mark of the true Luna before their pack was destroyed in a raid so old that most records of it had crumbled to nothing. She found fragments here and there, references in margins, half a page describing a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon resting just below the collarbone, said to appear only on daughters of unbroken Silvermoon blood. Marin closed the book slowly, her heart beating a little faster than it should have for a woman her age. She thought of the way Alara had flinched slightly whenever her collar shifted, the way she always kept the top of her tunic pulled high despite the warmth of her chamber. It could be nothing, it could be coincidence, but 30 years of service had taught Marin that coincidence rarely explained why ancient magic chose to stir after generations of silence. She resolved to say nothing yet, not to Draven, not to anyone. If she was wrong, raising such hope in a kingdom desperate for stability would only cause harm. If she was right, the truth would need to be handled with far more care than a hasty announcement in a crowded hall. For now, she would watch, and wait, and continue bringing the silent prisoner her meals with a closer eye than before. Meanwhile, in his study, Draven found himself staring at a blank page of correspondence he was supposed to be drafting to the neighboring pack leaders, his thoughts drifting instead to the woman locked 2 floors below him. It had been 6 days since her capture, and in that time, his certainty of her guilt had eroded more than he cared to admit. Every answer she gave him on parchment was steady, consistent, free of the panic or contradiction he had expected from someone hiding a crime. He set down his quill and rubbed a hand over his face, frustrated with himself as much as with the situation. He had built his reign on decisiveness, on never allowing doubt to slow him down when his kingdom's safety was at stake. Yet here he was, 6 days into an interrogation that had produced no evidence against her, and increasing evidence that his instincts had led him astray. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. Captain Roland entered, his expression grim in the way that always preceded bad news. "My king, we found something near the border," Roland said, stepping fully into the room. Tracks leading away from the site of the caravan attack. They belonged to a group, at least 6 wolves, moving fast toward the northern pass. Whoever did this was not traveling alone, and they were not traveling anywhere near where the prisoner was found. Draven's jaw tightened. "You are certain?" "The trackers are certain. The attack came from the north, moved east along the ridge, and doubled back toward the pass. The girl was found nearly 2 miles south of that route, alone, with no evidence of pack activity near her position." For a long moment, Draven said nothing, the weight of the information settling heavily over him. He had imprisoned a woman on suspicion built from proximity and silence, and now that suspicion was crumbling into something that looked uncomfortably close to injustice. "Increase patrols along the northern pass," he said finally. "I want to know who these 6 wolves are, and who sent them." Roland nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "And the prisoner, my king, shall I have her released?" Draven hesitated, the question landing somewhere he had not expected it to. "Not yet," he said. "I will handle it myself." Roland left without further comment, and Draven remained at his desk long after the door closed, staring at nothing in particular, turning over the strange discomfort building in his chest. He told himself it was simply the natural weight of guilt that came with wrongly imprisoning someone, nothing more complicated than that. But some quieter part of him, the part he rarely allowed himself to listen to, suspected the discomfort ran deeper than guilt alone. That evening, when he sent for Alara again, he found himself choosing his words more carefully than usual, aware suddenly of how much power he held over someone who had done nothing to deserve the fear she likely still carried toward him. She entered his study with the same quiet composure she always carried, parchment tucked against her side, and settled into the chair across from his desk without needing to be told. "My trackers found evidence today," he said, watching her face carefully as he spoke. "The attack on the caravan came from the north. You were found to the south. The tracks do not match your position." Alara's eyes lifted to his, something unreadable flickering behind them. She did not reach for the parchment immediately, simply held his gaze for a long moment, as though trying to determine whether this was another test disguised as honesty. "I told you the truth," she wrote finally, the words steady despite whatever emotion she was holding back. "I did not attack anyone. I was afraid, and I hid, because that is what I have always done when violence comes near me." Draven read the words twice, something twisting uncomfortably in his chest. "I believe you," he said quietly. "I should have believed you sooner." Alara studied him for a long moment before writing again. "Why did you not believe me sooner?" The question was fair, and it landed harder than he expected. He considered lying, offering some diplomatic excuse about the safety of his kingdom, demanding caution above all else. Instead, he found himself telling her something closer to the truth. "Because trusting easily has cost me before," he said. "My parents were betrayed by someone they trusted completely, someone who smiled at them for years while planning their deaths. I was young when it happened, but I learned quickly that trust is a luxury a king cannot always afford." Alara's expression softened slightly, the wariness in her eyes shifting into something closer to understanding. She wrote slowly, choosing her words with visible care. "I am sorry that happened to you, but I am not the danger you feared. I have only ever tried to survive, quietly, without asking for anything from anyone." Draven read the words, and felt something in his chest loosen, some tight coil of suspicion finally beginning to unwind. "I know that now," he said. "You are free to leave the castle whenever you wish, starting tomorrow. I will arrange an escort back to your village, along with provisions for your trouble." For a moment, something flickered across Alara's face that he could not quite name, gone too quickly for him to study it closely. She nodded, a small, polite gesture, and reached for a fresh sheet of parchment. "Thank you," she wrote. "I would like that." Yet even as she wrote the words, something in her chest hesitated, an unexpected reluctance she did not fully understand. Her village held nothing for her beyond the quiet anonymity she had built there, a life defined entirely by not being seen, not being known. Here, in this strange castle, surrounded by suspicion that had somehow softened into something gentler, she had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in longer than she could remember. The thought of returning to her old life, invisible and unspoken for, settled over her with a weight she had not expected. Draven watched her carefully as she wrote her thanks, noting the slight hesitation in her hand, the way her eyes lingered on the parchment a moment longer than necessary, before she set the quill down. He told himself it was not his concern, that once she left the castle, his obligation toward her would end, and life would return to its usual rhythm of border disputes and council meetings, and the quiet loneliness of ruling a kingdom alone. Yet as she was escorted from his study that evening, he found his eyes following her longer than they should have, some quiet, unfamiliar pull tugging at the edges of his composure. He dismissed it quickly, burying it beneath the weight of duties waiting on his desk, unaware that the ancient crest beneath his own throne room had grown warmer still that very evening, humming faintly, in a language only the oldest magic of Blackthorn still remembered how to speak. Below in the archive, Merrin closed another dusty text, her suspicions deepening with every page she read, and resolved that come morning, before any escort could be arranged, she would need to find a quiet moment to speak with Alara alone, away from guards, away from the king, away from anyone who might overhear a conversation that could change the course of the kingdom entirely. Morning light had barely touched the castle stones, when Merrin slipped into Alara's chamber, closing the door softly behind her. Alara sat on the edge of the cot, already dressed, her small bundle of belongings gathered for the journey she believed awaited her. She looked up in surprise as Merrin approached, setting the candle she carried onto the table with careful, deliberate movements. "I need to see something," Merrin said quietly, her tone gentle but urgent, in a way that made Alara straighten with sudden attention. "It may seem a strange request, but I promise it matters more than you know. Would you allow me to look at your collarbone, dear? The left side, just below your collar." Alara's hand rose instinctively to the fabric covering her chest, old instinct flaring, even though there was no threat in the old healer's eyes. She hesitated, studying Merrin's face for any sign of deception, finding only earnest concern staring back at her. Slowly, she nodded, and Merrin stepped closer, gently pulling the fabric aside just enough to reveal the pale skin beneath. There, exactly where the old text described it, was a birthmark, shaped unmistakably like a crescent moon, silver-toned against her skin, faint but unmistakable in the candlelight. Merrin's breath caught, her hand trembling slightly, as she traced the air just above the mark without touching it. "By the old moon," she whispered. "It is true." Alara pulled her collar back into place, confusion knitting her brow, as she reached for the parchment she kept nearby, out of habit now. "What is true?" she wrote, holding it up for Merrin to read. Merrin sat down heavily on the edge of the cot beside her, her earlier urgency replaced by something closer to reverent disbelief. "That mark," she said slowly, "belongs to the Silver Moon bloodline. It is the mark of the true Luna, dear. A mark that has not appeared in this kingdom in 3 generations, not since the last Silver Moon daughter was believed lost." Alara stared at her, the words settling strangely in her chest, too large and too impossible to process fully. She wrote quickly, her hand less steady than usual. "I do not understand. My pack was small. We had no titles, no importance. We were simple wolves, living quietly at the edge of the kingdom. Sometimes the old bloodlines hide themselves precisely to survive," Merrin said gently. "Perhaps your family knew what they carried, and chose to live quietly to protect you from those who might seek to use or destroy that bloodline. The Silver Moon line was hunted once, long ago, by those who feared the power a true Luna could hold beside an Alpha King." Alara's hands trembled slightly as she set the quill down, her mind racing through fragments of memory she had buried deep, memories of her mother speaking in hushed tones about a history she never fully explained, memories of being told never to show anyone the mark on her collarbone, never to speak of where her family had truly come from. She had been too young to understand the warnings fully, and after the attack that destroyed everything, there had been no one left to explain them to her. She picked the quill back up, If this is true, what does it mean? Maren considered the question carefully before answering. It means the ancient magic of this castle recognized something in you the moment you crossed its threshold. It means the crest beneath the throne room floor has been growing warm since the night you arrived, responding to a presence it has waited generations to find. It means, dear, that you may be the true Luna fated to stand beside King Draven, whether either of you were prepared for such a thing or not. Elara sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her chest like something physical. She thought of Draven's cold suspicion on the night of her capture, his sharp questions, the chains that had bound her wrists. She thought of the gentler moments that had followed, the careful conversations conducted entirely on parchment, the strange warmth that had begun to grow between them despite everything working against it. None of it made sense against the backdrop of what Maren was now suggesting. "I am to leave today," she wrote finally. "He arranged an escort back to my village." Maren's expression grew thoughtful. "Perhaps that escort should wait," she said. "This is not something to rush into announcing, not without careful consideration. A false claim to the Luna bloodline has torn kingdoms apart before, and a true claim, revealed carelessly, can bring just as much danger from those who would seek to use or destroy it. We must be certain, and we must be careful about who learns of this, and when." Elara nodded slowly, though uncertainty still churned within her. She trusted Maren's kindness, had felt it consistently since the night of her capture, but the idea of carrying such a significant truth, one that could reshape the entire kingdom's understanding of its future, felt like a weight far too heavy for someone who had spent 9 years trying desperately to remain unseen. "I will speak with the king," Maren said, rising from the cot. "Not about the mark, not yet. But I will suggest that your departure be delayed, that perhaps you remain in the castle a while longer, under the guise of continued healing and rest after your ordeal. It will give us time to understand what we are truly dealing with before anything is revealed." Elara nodded again, grateful for the older woman's careful guidance in a situation that felt increasingly beyond her understanding. As Maren moved toward the door, Elara caught her sleeve gently, holding up one more written line. "Please do not tell him yet. I do not know what this means for either of us, and I do not want him to see me differently before I understand it myself." Maren studied her for a long moment, something soft and knowing in her expression. "Of course, dear. This is your truth to reveal, in your own time, in your own way. I will simply buy you the time you need to find your footing first." With that, she left the chamber, and Elara sat alone once more, staring at the small mark hidden beneath her collar, a mark that had apparently been waiting her entire life to be discovered, carrying implications she was only beginning to grasp. Later that morning, Maren found Draven in the castle courtyard, overseeing the departure preparations for a patrol heading toward the northern pass. She waited patiently until he had finished his instructions before approaching, her expression carefully neutral despite the enormity of the secret she was carrying. "My king, might I have a word?" she said as he turned to acknowledge her. "Of course, Maren. What troubles you?" "The prisoner," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I have been examining her more closely these past days, and I believe the trauma she carries from her past runs deeper than simple silence. I would recommend she remain in the castle a while longer, under continued care, before any journey back to her village. Traveling in her current state could do more harm than good." Draven considered this, his expression thoughtful. He had already noticed the hesitation in Elara's response the evening before, the way her hand had lingered over the parchment, as though reluctant to accept the freedom he was offering. Perhaps Maren's assessment explained that reluctance, though something in him suspected there was more to it than simple trauma. "How long would you recommend?" he asked. "A few weeks, at minimum," Maren said. "Long enough for her to regain her strength properly, and perhaps, if she is willing, to explore whether her voice might return with proper care and patience. It would be a shame to send her back to isolation before we have given her every chance to heal." Draven nodded slowly, something in his chest easing at the suggestion, despite his best efforts to remain neutral about the matter. "Very well. She may remain, under your care, for as long as you believe necessary. See that she has whatever she needs." "Thank you, my king," Maren said, offering a small bow, before turning to leave, satisfied that she had bought Elara the time and space needed to navigate the discovery in her own way. As the days that followed unfolded, The rhythm between Alara and Draven shifted subtly, the formal interrogations giving way to something gentler, though neither of them named it directly. He began visiting her chamber in the evenings, rather than summoning her to his study, bringing books from his personal collection, teaching her fragments of the old sign language his mother had used to know, patiently working through gestures with her, until simple words could pass between them, without needing parchment at all. Alara found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit, the quiet companionship filling a space in her chest that had been empty for as long as she could remember. She watched the hardness in Draven's eyes soften further with each visit, watched the weight he carried, as King eased slightly in these private moments, away from the demands of his court. Yet always, beneath the growing warmth between them, the secret of her birthmark sat heavy in her thoughts, an unspoken truth she carried alone, even as their connection deepened. She wondered, some nights, what would happen when the truth finally surfaced, whether the gentle understanding, growing between them, could survive the weight of a destiny neither of them had chosen, but both of them, according to Marin's ancient texts, were somehow bound to. She did not know that far to the north, the 6 wolves responsible for the caravan attack were regrouping, planning a second strike far more ambitious than the first, one that would bring the danger directly to Blackthorn Castle's gates, and force the truth of her bloodline into the light far sooner than she or Marin had ever intended. 2 weeks passed, and Blackthorn Castle settled into an uneasy calm, the kind that always seemed to stretch thin over a kingdom before something broke it apart. Draven spent his mornings reviewing reports from the northern patrols, his frustration mounting, as each report returned with the same conclusion. The 6 wolves responsible for the caravan attack had vanished into the mountains, leaving no further trace behind. He did not know that vanishing had never been their intention. They were simply waiting, gathering strength, preparing for something far larger than a single caravan raid. In the quiet hours between his duties, Draven found himself increasingly drawn to Alara's chamber, though he told himself each time that his visits were simply an extension of his responsibility toward a former prisoner, still recovering under his roof. The excuse grew thinner with each passing evening, especially as their conversations deepened beyond simple pleasantries into something that felt dangerously close to friendship, and on his more honest nights, something closer still to affection he had no name for and no intention of examining too closely. One evening, he arrived at her chamber to find her seated near the window, watching the last light of sunset fade behind the mountains, her expression distant in a way he had not seen before. He knocked softly on the open door before entering, and she turned to him with a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "You seem troubled tonight," he said, settling into the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation, a familiarity that had grown between them without either of them formally allowing it. Alara reached for her parchment, considering her words carefully before writing. "I was thinking of my family. Sometimes the quiet here reminds me of home, before everything changed." Draven read the words, something in his chest tightening at the simple honesty of them. "Tell me about them," he said, "if you are willing. I know little of your life before the attack that took your voice." Alara hesitated, her quill hovering over the parchment as old memories stirred, most of them soft and golden with the particular glow that only childhood memories carried, made all the more precious by how abruptly they had ended. She began to write, slowly at first, then with growing ease, as the words found their way onto the page. "My mother used to sing while she cooked, even though she could not carry a tune well at all. My father taught me to track deer through the forest before I was old enough to hold a bow properly. We were not wealthy, but we were happy. I remember laughing more than I remember anything else from those years." Draven read each word carefully, something in his expression softening with a tenderness he rarely allowed anyone to witness. "It sounds like a good life," he said quietly. "I am sorry it was taken from you so young." Alara nodded, her eyes glistening slightly in the low candlelight, though no tears fell. She had cried enough for that loss over the years, that the grief had settled into something quieter now, a persistent ache rather than a fresh wound. She wrote again, "What was your childhood like, before your parents were taken from you?" Draven was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much of himself he was willing to share. It was not a subject he discussed often, not even with his closest advisors, yet something about the vulnerability she had just offered him made withholding his own feel unfair. My parents ruled with more warmth than most kings and queens allow themselves, he said finally. My mother especially. She believed a kingdom thrived on trust between its people and its leaders, not fear. She used to say that a crown worn with cruelty eventually crushes the one who wears it. When they were betrayed and killed, I was 15. Old enough to understand what had happened, too young to know how to carry it. I decided, somewhere in those early years of grief, that trust had been my mother's weakness, and that I would not repeat her mistake. I built walls instead. I ruled with suspicion, because suspicion, unlike trust, had never gotten anyone I loved killed. Elara listened to every word, watching the pain move across his face as he spoke, understanding it, in a way few others likely could, given the parallel grief they both carried from childhoods, interrupted by violence neither of them had chosen. She reached out, an instinctive gesture, and placed her hand gently over his, where it rested on the table between them. Draven went still at the contact, his eyes lifting to meet hers, something charged and uncertain passing between them in the quiet of the candlelit room. Neither of them moved for a long moment, the silence stretching comfortably rather than awkwardly, filled with an understanding that needed no words, spoken or written, to convey. I owe you an apology, he said eventually, his voice quieter than usual. For how I treated you that first night, for the chains, the accusations, the suspicion I held onto for far longer than the evidence ever supported. Elara shook her head gently, withdrawing her hand to write a response. You were protecting your people. I understand that better than most. That does not make it right, he said. You had already lost so much before you ever arrived here, and I added to that burden without cause. I would like to make amends for that, if you will allow it. She considered him for a long moment before writing her reply. You already have, simply by seeing me as more than my silence. Draven felt something shift in his chest at those words, a warmth he had not allowed himself to feel in longer than he could remember. He found himself studying her more closely in the candlelight, noticing details he had somehow missed before, the quiet strength in her posture despite everything she had endured, the gentle intelligence behind her eyes that no amount of silence could dim. May I ask you something else, he said, something that has nothing to do with the attacks or your past. She nodded, curious. Do you regret staying these past weeks? Marin tells me you have improved greatly, that your health has returned. You could have requested to leave by now, if you wished. Alara's hand hesitated over the parchment for a long moment, before she finally wrote her answer. I do not regret staying. For the first time in a long while, I do not feel entirely alone. The words settled between them like something fragile and precious, and Draven found himself unable to look away from her, the careful distance he had maintained since her arrival, dissolving further with each passing evening they spent together like this. He did not understand fully what was growing between them, only that it felt significant in a way few things in his carefully guarded life ever had. Nor do I, he admitted quietly. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the candle burning lower between them, until finally Draven rose to leave, lingering a moment longer at the door than necessary, before bidding her a quiet good night. Elara watched him go, her heart carrying a strange mixture of warmth and worry, aware that the secret of her bloodline still sat unspoken between them, a truth that could either deepen what was growing here, or shatter it entirely, depending on how and when it finally came to light. Below in the castle's oldest chamber, unseen by either of them, the ancient crest embedded in the throne room floor pulsed with warmth that had grown steadily stronger over the past 2 weeks, its ancient magic responding not only to Alara's presence within the castle walls, but to the bond quietly forming between her and the Alpha King himself, a bond the old magic had waited generations to witness take root. Neither Draven nor Elara noticed the way the castle's oldest wolves, the elders who remembered stories passed down from their own grandparents, had begun watching the pair with quiet, knowing interest, murmuring among themselves about old prophecies concerning a silent daughter of moonlight who would return to stand beside a king carved from grief and iron. The murmurs had not yet reached Draven's ears, kept quiet out of respect for Marin's request for caution, but they were spreading nonetheless, slow and steady, like the first signs of a change no one in the castle would be able to stop once it truly began. Far to the north, in a hidden camp carved into the rocky slopes of the mountain pass, a wolf named Cedric paced before a small fire, his patience wearing thin, as he waited for the last of his gathered fighters to arrive. Cedric had once served a minor pack broken apart by Blackthorn's expansion years earlier, and in the years since, he had built something new from the scattered survivors of a dozen shattered packs, all of them united by a shared hatred for the kingdom that had, in their eyes, stolen their homes and their futures. "The scouts confirm it," said a woman named Nora, stepping into the firelight with her arms crossed against the mountain cold. "Blackthorn's patrols have doubled along the northern pass, but their eastern approach remains thin. If we move within the week, before they shift their forces to cover the gap, we can breach the outer wall before anyone raises an alarm." Cedric nodded slowly, satisfaction curling at the edges of his mouth. "Good. The caravan attack was only meant to draw their attention north. Now we strike where they least expect it." He glanced toward the small group of fighters gathered around the fire, perhaps 30 in number, far fewer than Blackthorn's standing forces, but Cedric had never intended to win through sheer numbers. He intended to win through surprise, striking at the heart of the castle itself, before Draven's forces could properly mobilize. "And the girl they captured near the road?" Nora asked. "The one our scouts mentioned, still held within the castle walls?" "An unfortunate loose end," Cedric said, waving a dismissive hand. "Unimportant, unless she proves otherwise. Focus on the plan. We move in 5 days." Within the castle, unaware of the storm gathering in the mountains, life continued its careful rhythm. Alara had grown steadily more comfortable within Blackthorn's walls, her evenings with Draven becoming something both of them looked forward to with a warmth neither fully acknowledged aloud. Maren continued her quiet research into the Silvermoon bloodline, uncovering fragments of prophecy that spoke of a silent daughter whose voice, once returned, would herald a new era of strength for the kingdom she chose to protect. On the third evening after Cedric's fighters began their descent from the mountains, Draven found Alara in the castle gardens, rather than her usual chamber, seated on a stone bench beneath a blooming trellis, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. He approached slowly, aware of how at peace she seemed in this quiet corner of his home, a peace he found himself wanting to protect above almost anything else in his kingdom. "You found my mother's garden," he said, settling beside her on the bench. Alara turned to him, a soft smile touching her lips, and gestured toward the flowers around them, then toward herself, a question forming without words. "She planted most of these herself," Draven said, understanding her unspoken curiosity. "She believed a garden reflected the soul of whoever tended it. I have not had much time for gardens since she passed, though I suppose the staff have kept it alive well enough on their own." Alara reached for the small parchment she still carried out of habit, though their conversations had grown increasingly reliant on the gestures he had taught her over the past weeks. "It is beautiful," she wrote. "It reminds me a little of the garden my mother kept, though smaller. Perhaps you might help tend this one," Draven said, the suggestion slipping out before he had fully considered its implications. "If you wish to stay longer, that is. There is no reason you could not make a place for yourself here, beyond simply recovering under Maren's care." Alara's eyes lifted to his, surprise and something warmer flickering behind them. She had not allowed herself to consider a future within these walls too seriously, aware always of the secret she still carried, the truth about her bloodline that remained locked away between herself and Maren. Yet the offer, simple as it was, filled her chest with a hope she had not expected to feel again, after so many years of guarding herself against exactly this kind of vulnerability. "I would like that," she wrote finally, her hand steady despite the emotion swelling within her. Draven smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his usually stern features into something almost boyish in the moonlight. "Then it is settled. Blackthorn Castle has need of a new gardener, it seems, whether the staff realize it yet or not." They sat together beneath the stars for a while longer, the conversation drifting into easier, lighter territory, filled with small observations about the castle, about the mountains, about nothing of great consequence at all. Simply two people enjoying the quiet comfort of each other's company. Neither of them noticed the distant flicker of torchlight along the eastern ridge, barely visible even to trained eyes, nor the careful, silent movement of 30 fighters, descending steadily closer to Blackthorn's walls under the cover of darkness. It was Alara who noticed something first, 2 nights later, as she lay awake in her chamber unable to sleep, her senses sharpened by years of learned vigilance that had never fully faded, despite the safety she now felt within the castle. She heard it faintly at first, A sound carried on the wind that did not belong to the usual rhythm of castle life. Hushed voices speaking in low, urgent tones somewhere beyond the outer wall, followed by the unmistakable scrape of something metal against stone. She rose from her cot immediately, moving to the window, straining to see anything useful in the darkness beyond. The moon offered little light that night, clouds drifting thick across the sky, but she caught the briefest glimpse of movement along the eastern approach, shadows shifting, where no shadows should have been at this hour. Her heart pounded as old instincts flared to life, the same instincts that had once saved her life the night her pack was destroyed, instincts that told her, with absolute certainty, that danger was closing in on the castle walls. She did not hesitate. She moved to her door, testing it despite knowing it would be locked from the outside, then turned to the small window instead, calculating whether she could fit through the narrow gap between the bars. It would be tight, but possible. She worked quickly, shedding her outer layer to slim her frame enough to squeeze through the gap, ignoring the scrape of stone against her skin as she forced herself through, dropping down onto a narrow ledge below her window that connected, she remembered from her earlier observations of the castle's layout, to a service stairway used by the kitchen staff. She moved through the dark corridors with the same careful silence that had kept her alive for 9 years, avoiding the main halls where guards might question her unexpected freedom, heading instead toward the private wing, where she knew Draven's chambers were located. She had no voice to raise an alarm, no way to shout a warning through the sleeping castle, but she could reach him, and she could show him what she had seen with her own eyes. She reached his door and knocked urgently, then again when no immediate answer came, finally pushing the door open when she heard him stir within. Draven sat up sharply at the intrusion, reaching instinctively for the blade kept beside his bed, before recognizing her silhouette in the doorway. "Alara, what is wrong?" His voice carried immediate concern, noting the urgency in her posture, the way her chest heaved from the effort of moving quickly through the castle's dark corridors. She gestured urgently toward the window, then toward the eastern wall, her hands moving through the signs he had taught her with a desperate speed. Danger. East wall. Many. Draven was on his feet in an instant, pulling on his boots as he moved toward the window himself, scanning the darkness beyond. For a long moment he saw nothing, and worry crept into his expression, that perhaps exhaustion or fear had led her to imagine threats that were not truly there. Then, faintly, he caught it too, the same flicker of shadowed movement she had spotted from her own window, followed by the unmistakable glint of moonlight catching against a blade. "By the moon," he breathed, his entire posture shifting instantly into the sharp, commanding presence of a king preparing for war. "Sound the alarm," he said, moving quickly toward the door. "Get to Marin's chambers and stay there. I need to rally my guards before they breach the wall." Alara caught his arm before he could leave, shaking her head firmly, her expression fierce with a determination that startled him. She would not hide while danger closed in on the castle that had, against every expectation she carried when she first arrived here, become something close to a home. She gestured quickly. "Help. Fight, not hide." "Alara, I cannot protect you and lead my forces at the same time," he said urgently. "Please, for my sake if not your own, stay somewhere safe." She shook her head again, her jaw set with the same quiet stubbornness that had carried her through 9 years of survival on her own. She would not be locked away this time, not while there was something she could do to help protect the people who had, in these past weeks, become something worth protecting in return. Outside, in the darkness beyond the eastern wall, the first war horn sounded, shattering the quiet of the night as Cedric's fighters began their assault on Blackthorn Castle, the surprise of their approach finally lost, but their momentum already too far advanced to be easily stopped. The battle that would change everything, for the kingdom, for Draven, and for the truth Alara had carried silently within her since the moment she arrived, had finally begun. The war horn's echo had barely faded before the castle erupted into controlled chaos, guards pouring from the barracks with weapons drawn, servants ushered toward the safety of the inner keep, torches blazing to life along the walls, as Blackthorn's defenders scrambled to meet the threat now clearly visible along the eastern approach. Draven moved through the corridors with practiced speed, shouting orders that sent his forces converging toward the breach point, his earlier plea for Alara to stay safe forgotten in the urgency of the moment, as he assumed she would follow his instructions. She did not. Ilara moved through the castle in his wake, staying close enough to remain within sight of the chaos but far enough back to avoid immediate danger, her mind racing through everything she had observed about the castle's layout during her weeks of careful, quiet attention. She knew the service corridors better than most of the guards rushing past her, knew which passages connected to which towers, knowledge that had once been simple survival instinct and now felt like it might serve a far greater purpose. Near the eastern wall, Cedric's fighters had already breached the outer defenses, pouring through a gap they had spent days quietly weakening under cover of darkness, meeting Blackthorn's guards in a clash of steel and snarling fury that echoed across the courtyard. Draven fought at the front of his forces, his blade moving with the precision of a man who had trained for exactly this kind of moment his entire life, cutting down attacker after attacker as he pushed to close the breach, before more of Cedric's fighters could pour through. Ilara watched from a shadowed alcove near the courtyard's edge, her heart hammering as she took in the scale of the battle unfolding before her, more brutal and chaotic than anything she had witnessed since the night her own pack was destroyed. For a moment, old panic threatened to overwhelm her, the familiar paralysis that had kept her frozen and silent for so many years creeping at the edges of her mind. She forced it back, gripping the stone wall beside her, reminding herself that this time, she was not a helpless child hiding beneath a fallen beam. This time, she had knowledge that could matter, if she found the courage to use it. She caught sight of Captain Roland near the courtyard's edge, directing a cluster of guards toward the breach, and moved quickly toward him, gesturing urgently, until he noticed her presence and paused, startled to find her out of her chamber during the chaos. "You should not be here," he said sharply, though there was no time to escort her back to safety with the battle raging so close. Ilara ignored his concern, gesturing rapidly. Service passage, West Tower, behind them, the signs Draven had taught her flowing, with an urgency that overcame her usual careful precision. Roland's brow furrowed in confusion for a moment, before understanding dawned, his eyes widening as he grasped what she was trying to warn him of. "You believe they mean to flank us through the old service passage," he said, and she nodded firmly, gesturing again toward the West Tower, toward the narrow corridor she had used herself just hours earlier to escape her own chamber. Roland hesitated only a moment before shouting orders, redirecting a portion of his guards toward the western approach, sealing off the passage just as a smaller group of Cedric's fighters attempted exactly the flanking maneuver Ilara had warned of, catching them in a narrow bottleneck where Blackthorn's superior numbers turned the ambush against the attackers instead. Near the main breach, the battle had grown increasingly desperate, Draven pushing forward with a small group of his most trusted guards, in an attempt to reach Cedric himself, recognizing the enemy leader's distinctive presence directing the assault from the courtyard's edge. What Draven could not see, focused entirely on the fighters directly before him, was the archer positioned along the broken remains of the eastern wall, bow drawn and aimed with deadly precision toward the king's exposed side as he pressed forward into the fray. Ilara saw it first, her eyes catching the glint of the arrowhead in the torchlight from her position near the courtyard's edge, and without a single moment of hesitation, without any thought for her own safety, she was moving, sprinting across the chaotic courtyard toward Draven, with a speed born entirely of desperate urgency. "Draven," the word tore from her throat before she even realized what was happening, raw and unpracticed after 9 years of silence, cracking painfully in the middle, but unmistakably real, unmistakably a warning that reached him, just as the arrow released from the archer's bow. Draven turned instinctively at the sound of his name, a sound he had never once heard from her before, shock flashing across his face, even as his training took over, twisting his body just enough that the arrow that would have struck him directly instead grazed along his shoulder, painful but far from fatal. He staggered slightly, hand flying to the wound, then turned toward the sound of his name again, disbelief written across his features as he found Ilara standing several paces away, chest heaving, her hand pressed against her own throat as though astonished by what had just emerged from it. There was no time to process the enormity of the moment fully. Cedric's fighters pressed forward again, and Draven forced himself back into the battle, his shoulder burning but his focus sharpened by the knowledge that Ilara's warning had likely just saved his life. He fought with renewed intensity, his guards rallying around him, the tide of the battle slowly beginning to turn as Blackthorn's forces, better organized and defending familiar ground, began pushing Cedric's fighters back toward the breach they had come through. Alara remained near the courtyard's edge, her body trembling from the aftershock of what had just happened, both the terror of nearly watching Draven struck down, and the shock of her own voice breaking free after 9 long years of silence. She had not planned it, had not consciously decided that this moment, of all moments, would be when her voice finally returned. It had simply happened, torn from her by an instinct more powerful than the trauma that had silenced her for so long, the desperate need to protect someone who had come to matter to her more than she had allowed herself to admit. The battle raged for perhaps another hour before Cedric, recognizing the shifting tide against him, called for his remaining fighters to retreat back through the breach and into the cover of darkness beyond the walls, unwilling to lose his entire force in a battle that had already cost him more than he anticipated. Blackthorn's guards pursued only a short distance before Draven called them back, unwilling to risk his forces further in the darkness beyond familiar ground. As the last of the attackers vanished into the night, an uneasy quiet settled over the castle, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the shouted orders of guards, beginning the grim work of securing the breach and tending to the injured. Draven made his way through the aftermath, checking on his forces, directing the wounded toward Merrin's care, his shoulder throbbing beneath a hastily applied bandage, his mind still reeling from the moment Alara's voice had called out his name. He found her still near the courtyard's edge, sitting now on an overturned barrel, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, staring at her own hands as though they belonged to someone else entirely. He approached slowly, kneeling before her, his expression a complicated mixture of gratitude, concern, and something far more tender than either. "You spoke," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of everything that moment meant, both for the danger it had averted, and for the years of silence it had finally broken. Alara looked up at him, her eyes glistening, and for a moment she simply nodded, unable to trust herself to try speaking again so soon, after the overwhelming rush of finally breaking through a silence she had carried for nearly a decade. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she tried again, her voice rough and unpracticed but unmistakably present. "I could not lose you," she said, the words emerging haltingly, each one a small victory against years of silence that had once seemed permanent. "Not after everything." Draven's breath caught at the sound of her voice, fully formed now, carrying an accent softened by disuse, but achingly, undeniably real. He reached for her hand, holding it gently despite the ache in his own injured shoulder, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything else at all, the quiet aftermath of the battle settling around them, as something profound and unspoken passed between them, a recognition that whatever had been growing quietly over these past weeks had just become something neither of them could deny any longer. Neither of them noticed Merrin watching from a short distance away, her weathered face carrying an expression of quiet, knowing satisfaction, aware that the events of this night had set in motion something far larger than either of them yet understood, a truth about Alara's bloodline that could no longer remain hidden much longer, not after a battle that had proven, beyond any doubt, exactly how deeply the fates of the Silent Omega and the Alpha King had already become intertwined. Dawn broke gray and heavy over Blackthorn Castle, the courtyard still littered with the debris of the night's battle, despite the tireless work of servants clearing away broken weapons and scorched banners since the first hint of light appeared on the horizon. Merrin moved briskly through the healing chambers, tending to the wounded with practiced efficiency, though her mind remained fixed on the moment she had witnessed in the courtyard hours earlier, the moment Alara's voice had broken free after 9 years of silence to save the king's life. She found Draven in his study shortly after sunrise, his shoulder freshly bandaged, exhaustion evident in the lines of his face despite the alertness in his eyes. He looked up as she entered, waving off the guard who had escorted her without needing to be asked. "You should be resting, my king," Merrin said, though she knew well enough that suggestion would fall on deaf ears given the circumstances. "There is no time for rest," Draven replied. "I need to understand who attacked us and why, and I need to ensure my kingdom is prepared should they return with greater numbers." He paused, studying her expression carefully. "But I suspect that is not why you have come to see me this morning." Merrin hesitated only a moment before nodding, closing the study door behind her for privacy. "There is something you need to know about Alara, my king. Something I have kept from you these past weeks at her request, though after last night, I believe the time for secrecy has passed." Draven's expression sharpened with immediate attention. "Tell me." Do you remember the old texts describing the Silver Moon bloodline? Marin began. The family said to carry the mark of the true Luna, thought destroyed generations ago in a raid along the northern border. I remember the stories, Draven said slowly, uncertainty creeping into his voice as he began to sense where this conversation was heading. My grandfather spoke of them sometimes, though I always assumed they were little more than legend by now. They are not legend, Marin said. Ilara carries the mark, my king, a crescent moon birthmark beneath her collarbone, exactly as the old texts describe. I discovered it the morning you intended to send her back to her village, and I have spent these past weeks confirming what the old records tell us about what such a mark means. Draven sat in stunned silence for a long moment, processing the implications of what Marin was telling him. You are saying she is the true Luna, he said finally, the words feeling strange and enormous in his mouth. That the woman I imprisoned, accused, and nearly sent away in chains, is the fated match the old prophecies speak of. I believe so, yes, Marin said gently. The castle's ancient crest has been growing warmer since the night she arrived, responding to a presence it has waited generations to recognize. And after what happened last night, after her voice returned specifically to save your life, in the heat of battle, I do not believe there is much room left for doubt. Draven rose from his desk, moving to the window, his mind racing through every interaction he had shared with Ilara since her capture, every moment of suspicion, every moment of gentleness that had followed, all of it recontextualized now by this staggering revelation. He thought of the chains he had ordered placed on her wrists, the cold accusations he had leveled at her in the Great Hall, the weeks he had kept her imprisoned based on nothing more than proximity and silence. Shame settled heavily in his chest, mixing uncomfortably with the growing realization of what this truth meant for his kingdom, and for whatever was already growing between them. Why did you not tell me sooner? He asked, though his tone carried no real accusation, only exhaustion, and the weight of too much information, arriving too quickly, after a night already heavy with battle. Because it was not my truth to reveal, Marin said simply. Ilara asked for time, my king. Time to understand what the mark meant for herself, before it became something the entire kingdom would look to her to carry. Given everything she endured before ever arriving at these walls, I believed she deserved that time. Draven nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in Marin's reasoning, even as urgency pressed at him to act on this new knowledge immediately. Does she know that you have told me? Not yet. I felt you needed to hear this from me first, so that when you speak with her, you approach the conversation with understanding, rather than surprise, that might complicate an already delicate moment. Thank you, Marin, Draven said quietly. For your care of her, and for your wisdom in handling this with the caution it deserved. Marin offered a small bow, before leaving him alone with his thoughts, the weight of the revelation settling over him like a mantle he had not asked for, but could not now set aside. He remained at the window for a long while, watching the castle grounds slowly return to order after the chaos of the night before, his mind turning over the shape of a future he had never allowed himself to imagine, one where the crown he carried alone might finally be shared with someone who understood, in her own way, exactly what it meant to carry grief, transformed into strength. He found Ilara later that morning in the garden, seated on the same stone bench where he had offered her a place within the castle just days before, her expression thoughtful, as she watched the morning light filter through the trellis above her. She looked up as he approached, and something in his expression must have told her that this conversation would carry more weight than their usual quiet exchanges, because she straightened slightly, bracing herself for whatever he had come to say. Marin told me about the mark, he said, settling beside her without preamble, deciding that honesty, unadorned by careful diplomatic phrasing, was what this moment deserved. About the Silver Moon bloodline, and what it means. Ilara's breath caught, her hand rising instinctively toward her collar, old instinct flaring even though there was nothing left to hide, now that the truth had finally surfaced. I did not know how to tell you, she said, her voice still rough from disuse, but growing steadier with each sentence she spoke. I did not fully understand it myself, and I was afraid of what it might change between us, once you knew. What could it change? He asked gently. Beyond confirming what I think both of us have felt growing between us these past weeks, whether either of us was ready to name it or not. Ilara's eyes lifted to his, searching his expression for any trace of the coldness that had once defined his treatment of her, finding instead only warmth and something that looked remarkably like relief. "I was afraid you would see me differently," she admitted. "That you would see a title, a bloodline, a duty, rather than simply the woman you have come to know these past weeks." "I could never see you as only a title," Draven said firmly. "Not after everything I have learned about you since the night I wrongly accused you of crimes you had no part in. Not after you risked your own life to warn my guards of an ambush, and then risked it again to save mine in the middle of battle." He paused, reaching for her hand, holding it gently between his own. "The bloodline explains a great deal about the strange occurrences within these walls since your arrival, but it does not define who you are to me. That you have earned entirely on your own, through 9 years of surviving what would have broken most people, and through these past weeks of showing me, again and again, exactly what kind of strength lives quietly beneath silence." Alara felt tears rise unbidden at his words, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with ancient prophecies or magical bloodlines, and everything to do with being truly seen, perhaps for the first time in her entire life, by someone who valued her for exactly who she was, rather than what she might represent. "There is still much we do not understand," she said carefully, her voice growing steadier with practice. "What it means for me to be Luna, what responsibilities that carries, whether the kingdom will accept me, given how my arrival here began." "We will learn together," Draven said. "Whatever this means, whatever it requires of either of us, we will face it together, starting now." They sat together in the quiet garden for a long while after that, the weight of the revelation settling into something more manageable between them, a shared truth rather than a burden carried alone. Neither of them yet knew that Cedric, retreating into the mountains after his failed assault, had already begun planning a second attack, one far more desperate and dangerous than the first, driven now by rumors reaching his camp of a true Luna awakening within Blackthorn's walls, a rumor that, if true, threatened to unite the kingdom's scattered forces against him, in ways he could not afford to allow. The peace settling over the castle garden that morning, fragile and hard-won as it was, would not last nearly as long as either Alara or Draven hoped, though for now, wrapped in the quiet understanding finally passing openly between them, they allowed themselves this single, precious moment of simply being together, free from chains, free from suspicion, free from the silence that had once stood between them like an unbreakable wall. 3 days after the battle, Draven called his full court together in the great hall, the same hall where Alara had once stood in chains before him, judged and condemned without a fair hearing. This time, she stood beside him on the dais, not as a prisoner but as his intended equal, her posture steady despite the weight of dozens of curious and skeptical eyes turning toward her. "Many of you know this woman as the prisoner brought before us weeks ago, suspected of involvement in the caravan attacks," Draven began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall. "That suspicion was mine, and it was wrong. I owe her an apology I have already given privately, but I offer it again now, publicly, so that none of you mistake my earlier judgment for anything other than the error it was." A murmur rippled through the gathered court, glances exchanged between advisors and nobles, uncertain where this address was heading. Draven continued, his hand finding Alara's, steady and sure, despite the enormity of what he was about to reveal. "What none of you know is that this woman, Alara, carries the mark of the Silver Moon bloodline. She is the true Luna, fated by the old magic of this castle to stand beside its Alpha King." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle over the stunned silence that followed. "The crest beneath this very floor has recognized her since the night she first arrived within these walls, though none of us understood its significance until recently." The silence stretched for a long moment before Captain Roland stepped forward, one knee bending in a gesture of respect that rippled quickly through the rest of the gathered court, guards and nobles alike following his lead, until nearly the entire hall knelt before the pair standing on the dais. Not everyone knelt, however. Near the back of the hall, a nobleman named Gareth remained standing, his arms crossed, skepticism evident in the set of his jaw. He was an older man, one of Draven's father's former advisors, known throughout the court for his caution and his reluctance to embrace anything that smelled of old superstition dressed up as prophecy. "Forgive my hesitation, my king," Gareth said, stepping forward once the initial murmur of the court had settled. "But birthmarks can be counterfeited, and ancient prophecies have been used before to manipulate the trust of desperate kingdoms. How can we be certain this claim is genuine, and not simply a convenient story, constructed to explain a growing attachment between yourself and a former prisoner? The accusation landed sharply in the hushed hall, and Alara felt her chest tighten at the implication, old fear of being disbelieved rising briefly before she forced it down, reminding herself that she had earned her place in this hall through actions no counterfeit claim could replicate. The mark was confirmed by Marin, who has served this castle faithfully for 30 years and has no reason to fabricate such a claim, Draven said, his voice hardening slightly at the challenge, though he kept his tone measured rather than allowing anger to color his response. Beyond that, Gareth, I would remind you that this woman risked her own life twice during the recent attack. First, to warn my guards of a flanking maneuver that saved countless lives, and second, to warn me directly of an archer's arrow that would have otherwise struck me fatally. Her voice, silent for 9 years following the destruction of her birth pack, returned specifically in that moment of danger to save mine. If that is counterfeit, I do not know what genuine devotion would look like. Gareth studied the pair for a long moment, something in his stern expression softening slightly at the accounting of events he had clearly not fully understood before this moment. I meant no disrespect, he said finally, offering a measured bow. Only caution, as befits my role in this court. If what you say is true, then Blackthorn is fortunate indeed to have found its true Luna in such trying times. Caution is not disrespect, Draven acknowledged. I welcome it, so long as it does not blind us to truth, once that truth has been fairly demonstrated. The tension in the hall eased gradually after that exchange, the remaining nobles offering their own gestures of respect toward Alara, some more enthusiastic than others, though the overwhelming mood shifted toward cautious acceptance rather than outright doubt. Alara remained quiet through most of the exchange, her voice still new and precious to her, used sparingly as she grew accustomed to its return after so many years of silence. Later that evening, once the court had dispersed and the great hall stood empty once more, Alara found herself walking its length slowly, her footsteps echoing against the same stones where she had once stood in chains, judged before she had ever been given a chance to explain herself. Draven found her there, watching quietly from the doorway before approaching. You are thinking of that first night, he said, understanding without needing to ask. Alara nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than pained. It is strange, she said, her voice growing steadier with each day of practice, to stand in this same hall now, treated so differently than I was then. I do not resent you for how it began, but I will not pretend it did not hurt. You have every right to that hurt, Draven said quietly. I was wrong to judge you as I did, wrong to assume guilt from silence and proximity, rather than seeking understanding first. I cannot undo those first days, but I can promise you that I will spend whatever years I am given, making certain you never again feel judged before you are truly known. Alara studied him for a long moment, something in her chest easing at the sincerity in his voice. The same sincerity that had slowly, patiently, earned her trust over these past weeks despite everything working against it. I believe you, she said finally. And I forgive you, not because you deserve it easily, but because I have seen, again and again, exactly how much you have changed since that first night. Draven reached for her hand, holding it gently in the quiet of the empty hall. Thank you, he said, for your patience and for your grace, both of which I know I have not always deserved. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the great hall around them no longer feeling like the site of her earlier judgment, but something transformed entirely, a place where a new understanding between them had finally been given room to grow into the light. Neither of them yet knew that far to the north, Cedric had received confirmation of the rumors reaching his camp. Word of a true Luna awakening within Blackthorn's walls, threatening to unite the kingdom's scattered forces against him, in ways his diminished numbers could not withstand for long. Cedric, desperate and cornered by his own failing plans, had begun considering options he would never have entertained before, reaching out to darker allies along the kingdom's border, who cared nothing for prophecy or bloodlines, only for the chaos and opportunity a weakened Blackthorn might offer them. The peace settling over the castle in these quiet days would not last much longer, though for now, within the walls of Blackthorn, a fragile new trust continued growing steadily stronger, preparing itself, unknowingly, for the far greater test that awaited just beyond the horizon. Cedric's new allies arrived at his mountain camp, under cover of a heavy autumn storm. 3 riders wrapped in dark cloaks who spoke little of where they came from, and even less of why they were willing to lend their strength to a cause that was not their own. Their leader, a gaunt man named Silas, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to violence, conducted far from the light of honest battle. "You want the castle weakened before the true attack," Silas said, studying the crude map Cedric had spread across a flat stone near the fire. "That can be arranged. We have methods that do not require an army at your gates." "What methods?" Cedric asked, distrust evident in his tone, despite his desperation for any advantage against Blackthorn's superior forces. "Poison, delivered quietly, through channels your obvious soldiers could never reach. A castle sickened from within falls far easier than one defended by healthy guards at full strength." Silas's smile carried no warmth at all. "Give us 3 days within the castle's supply chain, and by the time you launch your assault, half their forces will be too ill to lift a blade." Cedric considered this for a long moment, old instincts warning him against allies whose methods felt uncomfortably close to the kind of dishonorable tactics he had always claimed to despise in the kingdom he blamed for his losses. Yet desperation had a way of eroding principles that once felt unshakable, and after his failed first assault, he found himself unable to refuse an advantage that might finally deliver the victory his scattered forces so desperately needed. 3 days, he agreed finally. No more, and nothing that endangers those not directly tied to the castle's defense. Silas's smile did not waver, though something in his eyes suggested such restrictions meant little to him, beyond words offered to ease Cedric's conscience. "Of course," he said. "We will begin at once." Within Blackthorn Castle, the days that followed carried an uneasy quiet, the aftermath of the first attack still lingering in repaired walls and increased patrols, though life had gradually begun returning to something resembling normalcy. Alara's voice grew steadier with each passing day, practiced through quiet conversations with Marin, with Draven, with the castle staff who had grown increasingly warm toward the woman, now openly recognized as their future Luna. She spent her mornings in the garden, tending the flowers her future mother-in-law had once planted, and her afternoons increasingly involved in council discussions Draven insisted she attend, valuing her perspective on matters ranging from border security to the kingdom's care for villages like the one she had once called home. It was during one such council meeting, 3 days after Silas and his allies had infiltrated the castle's supply chain, that the first signs of trouble began to surface. A young guard stumbled into the council chamber, his face pale and sweating despite the cool autumn air, collapsing before he could deliver whatever message had brought him rushing through the halls. Marin was at his side instantly, pressing a hand to his forehead, her expression darkening with immediate concern. "Fever," she said, high and sudden. "This is not natural illness." Within hours, a dozen more guards had fallen ill, with the same symptoms. Fever and weakness, spreading rapidly through the castle's ranks, striking down its defenders with alarming speed. Marin worked tirelessly through the day, examining the sick, searching for the source of the affliction, until finally, examining the remains of a grain shipment received 3 days earlier, she found traces of a substance she recognized from old, forbidden texts on poisons rarely used in honest warfare. "Someone infiltrated our supplies," she told Draven urgently, finding him in the courtyard, directing the reorganization of his remaining healthy forces, deliberately, and recently. This was no accident. Draven's expression hardened with immediate understanding. "Cedric," he said. "He means to weaken us before striking again." As if summoned by the very mention of his name, a scout arrived moments later, breathless from his ride, confirming exactly the threat Draven had feared. "My king, forces are massing along the eastern ridge, larger than before, joined by riders bearing no banner we recognize. They move toward the castle even now." The timing was no coincidence, and Draven understood immediately the trap closing around them, a fraction of his forces already weakened by illness, facing an enemy force larger and more determined than the one that had nearly breached their walls just weeks before. He turned to his remaining healthy guards, already calculating strategies, already preparing to face a battle his depleted forces might not be able to win through strength alone. Alara found him in the midst of these urgent preparations, her expression fierce with a determination that had grown steadily since the night her voice first returned in the heat of battle. "I want to help," she said, her voice steady and sure despite the danger gathering just beyond the castle walls. "Alara, our forces are weakened. This battle will be far more dangerous than the last." "I know," she said, "which is exactly why you need every advantage available to you, including whatever this bloodline within me is capable of, even if neither of us fully understands its limits yet." Draven studied her for a long moment, torn between the instinct to protect her and the growing respect he held for her judgment, earned through everything she had already proven capable of since her arrival at these walls. "What do you propose?" he asked finally. Marin's texts mention that a true Luna's voice, once fully returned, carries strength beyond ordinary words, capable of rallying and healing those who hear it, with sincere intention behind it. "I do not fully understand what that means, but if there is even a chance it could help our weakened forces, I want to try." Draven nodded slowly, trusting her instincts even as worry gnawed at his chest. "Then we will face this together, as we agreed we would." The battle that followed came swiftly and violently, Cedric's forces striking at the weakened eastern wall with renewed ferocity, joined by Silas and his dark allies, who fought with a ruthless efficiency that made clear exactly how dangerous their earlier poison had truly been. Blackthorn's defenders, though weakened, fought with the desperate courage of those defending their home, Draven at their center, his blade moving with relentless precision, despite the mounting odds against them. Alara moved among the wounded and the weakened during the battle's early chaos, her hands steady as she helped Marin tend those too ill to fight, her voice offering words of encouragement that seemed, remarkably, to carry an unexpected strength wherever she spoke them. A guard too weakened by fever to stand found himself rising, strength returning to his limbs as her voice urged him toward the fight. Another, wounded and losing hope, felt renewed determination flood through him at her quiet, steady words of reassurance. Word spread quickly through the beleaguered defenders that something remarkable was happening, that the true Luna's voice carried strength that seemed to push back against the very weakness Silas's poison had inflicted upon them. Whether it was genuine ancient magic, or simply the powerful effect of hope restored to exhausted, frightened soldiers, the result was the same. Blackthorn's forces rallying with renewed strength that began, slowly but unmistakably, to turn the tide of a battle that had seemed, just hours earlier, nearly unwinnable. Near the height of the fighting, Draven found himself facing Cedric directly, the two leaders meeting in single combat amid the chaos surrounding them, years of grievance and desperation fueling Cedric's every strike. Draven fought with equal intensity, driven by the knowledge of everything at stake, his kingdom, his people, and the woman whose voice he could hear rising above the chaos, lending strength to every defender within earshot of its steady, determined call. The duel ended when Cedric, exhausted and increasingly desperate, made a critical error, overextending his reach in a strike meant to end the battle decisively. Draven seized the opening immediately, disarming him with practiced efficiency, and pressing his blade against Cedric's throat before the other man could recover. "Yield," Draven commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of a king who had, in this moment, proven beyond any doubt exactly what he was capable of protecting. Cedric, seeing his remaining forces scattering under the renewed strength of Blackthorn's rallied defenders, finally lowered his gaze in defeat, yielding with whatever dignity remained available to him after a plan built on desperation had finally, decisively, collapsed entirely. As the battle's chaos gradually settled into the quiet aftermath of victory, Alara made her way through the courtyard, her voice growing hoarse from hours of continuous encouragement offered to every weakened defender she passed, yet her heart lighter than it had been in longer than she could remember, having finally proven to herself, beyond any lingering doubt, exactly what her reclaimed voice was capable of achieving when offered freely, in defense of those she had come to love. She found Draven near the center of the courtyard, wounded but standing, his eyes finding hers across the scattered aftermath of battle, with an expression of relief and pride that needed no words to convey. She moved toward him without hesitation, and as their eyes met amid the settling dust and smoke of the battle they had faced and won together, both of them understood, without needing to speak it aloud, that whatever challenges still awaited Blackthorn Castle in the days ahead, they would face them exactly as they had faced this one, together, as equals, bound not merely by ancient prophecy but by a trust and devotion that had been earned, slowly and honestly, through everything they had already overcome. In the days following the battle, Blackthorn Castle slowly rebuilt itself around a new sense of purpose. The walls repaired stone by stone, the wounded tended carefully back to health under Marin's watchful guidance, and the story of the true Luna's voice, rallying a weakened army, spreading quickly through every corner of the kingdom, until it reached villages far beyond the castle's own borders. Cedric, held in careful confinement rather than harshly punished, offered what information he could about Silas and his allies, revealing a network of mercenaries willing to sell their skills to any cause desperate enough to afford them. Information Draven's forces used to hunt down the remaining threat before it could regroup elsewhere. Ilara spent these healing days moving freely through the castle she had once entered in chains, her voice growing stronger and steadier with each passing day, no longer merely reclaimed, but fully hers again, carrying the same quiet strength that had once expressed itself only through careful, patient words written on parchment. She found herself speaking more each day, not from any obligation, but from genuine desire, sharing thoughts and observations she had carried silently for years, finally given room to breathe in the open air of a life no longer defined by isolation. Nobleman Gareth, whose earlier skepticism had given way entirely to respect after witnessing her voice rally the kingdom's weakened defenders, approached her one afternoon in the castle gardens, offering a formal apology for his earlier doubt. "I judged too quickly, before I understood what you were truly capable of," he said, bowing with genuine humility. "The kingdom is fortunate to have found its true Luna, and I am grateful to have witnessed proof of that truth with my own eyes." Ilara accepted his apology with the same grace she had shown Draven weeks earlier, understanding that caution, even when it stung, had its own value in a kingdom that had suffered enough from misplaced trust in its history. "I hope, in time, to earn the trust of everyone within these walls, not merely through prophecy, but through the choices I make each day as Luna." As the final preparations began for the formal ceremony that would recognize Ilara's place beside Draven, before the full court, and the gathered representatives of villages throughout the kingdom, Draven found her once more in the garden, watching the late afternoon light settle golden over the mountains beyond the castle walls, the same view that had first drawn her to this quiet corner of his home weeks earlier. "Are you ready?" he asked, settling beside her on the familiar stone bench. Ilara considered the question carefully, her mind turning over everything that had brought her to this moment. The chains of her first night within these walls, the slow unraveling of suspicion into trust, the battles fought and survived, the voice reclaimed, not through gentle healing alone, but through the fierce, protective love that had grown steadily between them, despite everything working against it in the beginning. "I am," she said finally, her voice carrying the same steady confidence that had once seemed impossible for a woman who had spent 9 years unable to speak at all. "Not because prophecy demands it, but because I choose it, freely, exactly as I have chosen everything since the night I first decided to trust you enough to warn you of danger, rather than simply protecting myself alone." Draven reached for her hand, holding it gently in the golden evening light. "Then let us begin this next chapter together," he said. "Not as king and prisoner, not as alpha and reluctant omega, bound by circumstances neither of us chose, but as equals, exactly as the old magic of this castle always intended us to become." The ceremony that followed, held 3 days later beneath the same great hall where Ilara had once stood in chains, transformed that space entirely, filled now with warmth and celebration rather than cold suspicion. Representatives from villages throughout the kingdom gathered to witness the formal recognition of their true Luna, Marin standing proudly near the front of the assembled crowd, Gareth and Roland positioned among the honored guests who had once doubted but now stood firmly in support. When Draven placed the ceremonial circlet upon Ilara's brow, marking her formally as Luna, before the full weight of the kingdom's attention, she felt none of the fear that had once defined her existence, only a quiet, steady pride in exactly who she had become, a woman who had survived unspeakable loss, who had endured wrongful imprisonment with dignity, who had reclaimed her voice not through simple healing, but through fierce, protective courage, and who now stood ready to help guide a kingdom toward a future built on the same trust and understanding that had slowly, patiently grown between herself and the king who had once judged her too quickly, before understanding, at last, exactly what quiet strength had been standing before him all along, As the celebration continued long into the evening, filled with music and laughter that echoed through halls that had once held only cold suspicion, Draven and Alara stood together near the castle gates, looking out over the kingdom they would now guide together, no longer captor and prisoner, no longer stranger and suspect, but king and Luna. Bound by fate, yes, but bound far more deeply by every choice they had made together to reach this moment. Choices built on honesty, on courage, and on a trust earned slowly and honestly through everything they had faced and overcome, side by side, exactly as they intended to face whatever challenges still awaited them in all the years still ahead.